All right, so just as a refresher to remind us where we're at in the process of kind of a holistic view of classical apologetics. Remember how we talked about the first goal is typically to establish the plausibility of the belief in a God. Some of the arguments that stem from the natural world, the nature of reality, like we'll be talking this evening, the mind and the moral nature of humanity. Some of those things are arguments for the existence of a God, but not necessarily the God of the Bible, just some force or presence that might be considered God. The second step of apologetics is, okay, if we can establish that it's plausible to believe in some kind of God, how do we then try to establish that the God of the Bible is the most reasonable God to believe in? And so there are new sheets in the back for what I've titled Lesson 4. And that's going to start looking at some of the second step of classical apologetics, which is, okay, if we can establish that there may be a God, how do we know it's the God of the Bible? And so the first way that we'll do that is when we get to that lesson, looking at these historical evidences that are out there for things in the Bible, particularly focusing on Jesus. We might get to that Sunday if we get through all the rest of this lesson, but there is still quite a bit of material that I'm interested in covering in today's lesson. So we ended things on talking about the mind. We were talking about the human mind and how unique it seems to be apart from other species. The fact that we can ponder things that are far beyond just our physical environment. Animals and creatures, they don't show the same curiosity for their origins that we do. They don't show the same curiosity for things that are far and above, greater than they are. They're interested in just the hard truths of survival. What I left us with was a question of the materialistic or the naturalistic description of human consciousness. If you take a naturalistic view, then you have to conclude that human consciousness comes from the chemical and electrical signals in our biological brains. Essentially that the human mind is wholly and completely contained in the human brain. And I asked you on Sunday, what challenges arise if we believe that? What are some things that you would say to someone if they say, well, what you think is your mind is only just your brain. It's just the physical matter and the physical interactions going on in your brain. What would you say to someone who believed that? How to explain dreams? Okay.
Because that's not a conscious, that's a subconscious thing that's happening, so you can't do anything that's, you're not controlling that, it's an involuntary, I guess you would call it.
Right.
Yet it has ties to previous experiences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that there's some processes that the brain seems to be doing that are involuntary. If I were the skeptic, I would say, but animals dream too. We see pets reacting while they're asleep as if they were dogs will pretend they're chasing something in their sleep. Dogs can dream. So we do see that behavior in animals. And if I were a skeptic, I may also say, well, just because some processes of the brain are involuntary, it doesn't mean that they're still not natural processes. They're just neurons firing. They're just chemicals and electricity going through the brain. So there may be some counters to that. Do you think there's another point there you were trying to make with pointing out dreams?
Well, I guess with animals, you can't ask them what they were dreaming, and
No.
whereas with humans, they can relay what their dreams were.
Right, and that point goes back to some of the things we established on Sunday, which are what are the unique traits of human minds, is we can communicate what's on our mind, and we can communicate the things that we imagine. It's not just the things that are, it's the things that we just think about that we can share with other people. So that is one that points to the uniqueness of the human mind. What I'm getting at is there's an issue if our minds are purely materialistic. And that is, I think, wouldn't that mean that human thought is deterministic, essentially? I mean, how are you able to make any choices if everything that happens within your brain is just chemistry and electricity and cells? If there's no thing that's outside of the physical that makes up our mind, if our mind is nothing beyond just the physical, that seems to counteract just our own lived experience, does it not? I mean, how else would we be able to say, I can decide whatever I want to do. I can think and premeditate on whatever I want to do for the day or whatever kinds of actions I want to take, and I'm free to. Is free will an illusion if our minds are simply our physical brains? That's kind of the contention that I'm getting at. I think it goes against our reality where we can hold people accountable for their motivations or the choices that they make. If a person's mind is just the chemistry and the physical nature of their brain, why do we find fault with people who do things that we don't like? I mean, can you control the cells that are in your brain? Can you choose how they're arranged? I think the materialist view of the human mind, it forces us not to distinguish any value or any measures of value. If the human mind is purely material, I also think that we would then be forced to answer the question, well, is the human mind of any greater value than an animal mind? Or, interestingly, an artificial intelligence that is sufficiently like a human mind? If the human mind is purely a physical object, and electricity and signals and energy going through a physical object, then you could simulate it, could you not? I mean, eventually, with sufficiently advanced technology, you could simulate it, and you would be hard-pressed to say, how is that different than a human brain?
Would you have a consciousness?
Well, that's kind of the question I'm getting at is, in our experience, consciousness seems to be outside of the box of our brains. If you imagine, I heard an analogy, which is the natural world has an explanation for the box. We can explain anything that fits inside of the box of that which is natural. And the brain, the actual organ that you can hold in your hand, the brain is natural and it fits within the box. But the mind is another layer of the brain that doesn't find an explanation within that box. It comes from somewhere outside the box. And if we try to say that the mind comes from within the box, do you really have consciousness? Do you really have free will? Are you really making choices, or are you just reacting to all of the things that ended up resulting in you? That's what I mean by, would human thought be deterministic, or would free will be an illusion if our brains are merely physical and if our mind is tied 100% to the physical brain? Dan?
I think it goes back to what your dad said Sunday morning, in that, we have the choice. If we were all just a series of synapses and functions going on, we would always choose what is best for ourselves first. We don't always do that. A lot of times we make choices that are bad for ourselves, and continue to make the same choices that are bad for ourselves. So, if it was just strictly, AI, it's always going to come out with the best solution, best answer, and we don't always come up with the best solution and the best answers. We always, we may be thinking, altruistically about the benefit of others as opposed to our own well-being, and that's not always what you see. On occasion, you will see, yes, a dog that will sacrifice for their owner or something like that. You rarely see a cat that would sacrifice for its owner, but you do see, you see things like that, but you don't see that's tied to maybe one person. They don't find themselves doing what's best for somebody outside of their realm of immediate influence or immediate proximity.
Right.
They will, whereas humans will go beyond that. Our thought process goes beyond that, and therefore it doesn't really say, it doesn't fit inside that box, because that box is what is best for us. What is in my best interest is to continually make the decisions that are in my best interest, as opposed to what's in the interest of others.
Right. And that touches on a few of the things that I think we'll get to this evening also, in talking about morality and what is the moral law, if that exists or not, whether that's a real thing. We'll talk about that in a bit. Go ahead, Dad.
I think it'd be challenging for a materialistic mind to resolve a lack of understanding of the natural world by leaping to a supreme being or higher being. I think there would be a challenge there. It doesn't seem as though that's a logical thought process unless that mind has been designed
Okay. So maybe to summarize, you can tell me if this is right. If our brains were purely material, why then does the human mind so often seek God or seek something that is outside of nature or outside of purely a natural realm? Is that kind of the point you're trying to make? Yeah, I would say so. That seeking of something that is outside of the natural, that longing for the supernatural, I think is present in pretty much all of humanity, all of human history. The desire for something that is beyond just ourselves. If our brain is just an organ responding to stimuli, then that serves no function, because that doesn't make us. There's no natural reason why we would seek those kinds of things. There's no function that's satisfying. Our hearts and our lungs, they satisfy a natural function that is dependent on the natural world. Our lungs work because there's air. Our heart works because there's blood, and they all work because there's nerves and electricity. They have a natural function, but the mind doesn't always have a purely natural function. It can function beyond what is natural and think about things that are beyond what is natural. Where does that come from if it's just from nature? If you could, with a sufficiently complex computer, map out and simulate an entire human brain and send all the signals through it, would it be a person? I don't think the same. I think there's something missing. There's some kind of sauce that's missing, and I think that's in the mind. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
You mentioned the animals. Is it all right to say that animals are intelligent?
I believe there's animals that show varying levels of intelligence, and it's fair to say some are more intelligent than others.
Yeah, God really said that animals are smarter than man. Well, he said the donkey, the animal knows, the donkey knows the crib, and the ones that feed it, but he said my people do not know, they do not consider. So some animals are smarter than some people.
That's right. The Bible also points to ants as, being industrious and being good at their jobs. Animals do a much better job than people at not breaking the rules that govern, the best mode of operation for animals. Animals, you don't have to really teach them what to do, and they tend to operate in their best interests because they're programmed to do so. I say programmed, we understand, I'm meaning their instincts that are given to them. Humans are terrible at following our instincts. We tend to violate instinct all the time.
Yeah, I didn't get the quoted right. So the animals, I forgot it again. Go ahead.
Okay. That's all right.
Andrew, I think something interesting, you were talking about we're missing something, and when you look at our artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and all these new things that are being created, and how the only reason they're able to create random things is because they're feeding off of everything we've given them.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone talks about well, when will they be able to create something themselves? And the answer is never. They can't create because they can't think, therefore there is no creativity. And so I think that's where that missing piece is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree as well. Currently, the way we understand artificial intelligence, it only works by piecing together and just trying to make a assimilation of all the knowledge it can gather from other things that it's already been made. And I think that our minds are capable of genuine creation, like you say. And that, to go back to the points we made on Sunday, if the human mind is in the image of God, well, God is capable of pure creation. God is capable of creativity where there was no guide or nothing to base it off of. And while a lot of human creativity, you could argue, maybe it's inspired by something that came before it. Maybe an artist, learned by watching another artist, but there's still that uniqueness to each artist's work, or to a musician's compositions. You can find that uniqueness, even if there's patterns that we tend to repeat. So good points there. Okay, I wanted us to try to think about what are some Bible verses that came to mind, or that you were able to find, that speak to this idea that we're talking about, that there is a mind, that there is a consciousness that is created within us. Could you think of any or find any? Maybe some of these you have to be a little bit creative with. I found a few that maybe bend the rules just a little bit. But the reason I do this is I keep trying to bring us back to, if you had to try to find this in the Bible, can you find it? Because as we talk this through with someone else, a useful tool is, okay, we talk through all these arguments, we talk through the to use Dad's word, the metaphysical nature of our existence and our thought. But if we can bring it back to, hey, look at this. isn't it interesting that this kind of concept can be found in the Bible, that the Bible is sympathetic to the human mind? What are some passages you all came up with? I want to hear what you have here.
So did you ask what are passages that talk about the conscience?
Yes, let me reread the way I phrased it in the questions. Can you think of any scriptures that seem to acknowledge the nature of the human mind and consciousness?
The one I'm thinking of off the top of my head is, which I can't cite the exact passage off my head, but it's in Romans where it talks about is that the one that talks about moral, like we know what's right and wrong, even the Gentiles know what's right and wrong?
Right. Romans chapter 2 covers that concept of the Gentiles doing by nature the things that are within the law. And we might actually come back to this when we talk about the moral law, because I think this repeats itself under that idea. But in chapter 2, verse 14, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. So here, Paul is acknowledging that the Gentiles have this consciousness, and that humans have this consciousness. Here he's making the case that this consciousness drives us to behave in a way that we view as either right or wrong, even if we haven't been given the law of Moses. So that's a point we will return to, but that's a good one. Any others? Other examples?
Andrew, I would suggest maybe bending the rules a little, that 2 Peter chapter 1, it's talking about having seen the divine power. Verse 4, these things, for by these he has granted to us precious and magnificent promises, in order that by them you might become partakers of the divine nature. And I think we probably understand that to be fellowship with God, but God is not granting fellowship with him with anything that is not of a divine nature. So there's got to be something beyond the chemical and the synapse in order to share with divinity.
Okay. So partaking of a divine nature isn't possible unless we have some facsimile or some type of divinity present in our minds, some kind of divinity that has left an imprint on our mind beyond just our physical brains. I can see what you're getting at with that passage there. Go ahead.
How about Ecclesiastes 3:11, that God has set eternity in man's heart?
That was actually the one that I had forgotten to write down. Ecclesiastes 3:11, that eternity is set on our hearts. Right. So that idea of that there is a longing for something that is beyond us, a longing for that eternity. I think that's certainly a good one there. Go ahead, Zach.
Here in 1 Timothy, it gives this idea of talking about false teachers and then going on and talking about the good news of Jesus and the idea of him saving sinners. And in 1 Timothy 1, verse 5, it says, the aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart, good conscience, and sincere faith. And you skip down to verse 19, when it brings up the idea of Jesus Christ coming to save sinners, in verse 19 saying, holding faith and a good conscience, by rejecting this, some had made shipwreck of their faith. Giving this idea of where your conscience needs to be and avoiding false teachers and putting your faith, putting your conscience being led by your faith.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's a good example there. And again, I think this is another example that probably we'll speak to in a bit with regard to morality and the idea of the conscience being this moral guide, and we feel this pressure of things that are right and wrong within our conscience. And to make the distinction between conscience and consciousness, conscience being that force for right or wrong, that pressure that guides us into saying, this is what I ought to do, this is what I ought not to do. Consciousness just being I am an entity. I consider myself an entity. I have an inner voice. I have inner thoughts. One example that I had is in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. In 2 Corinthians 4, Paul is talking about renewal. And he says that we are, in verse 16, So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. So Paul here is talking about two versions of the self, the outer self and the inner self. And the outer one is physical. The outer self withers, the outer one passes away, it dies. But Paul acknowledges that there is an inner self that can be independent of what's happening to the outer self. There is a person in there. We're not just bodies. We are selves. We have an inner self. Romans 7:22 also has this idea where Paul writes that we delight in our inner being. So that term inner self or inner being. Did anyone else have examples? John?
Audrey gave me her importance of back to her Bible. I just picked out one of them. 1 Corinthians 2:16, it just says, or who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him, but we have the mind of Christ, so our mind is to be like his.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing I was thinking about is, like on the day of Pentecost, when they spoke different languages, somehow or another our mind, God can go and put data in directly into our mind and change and create some crazy things can happen, through our mind, our brain. So there's definitely some kind of a link to each other or to God that he can pass into and take over, just like you might take over a computer, I guess.
Right.
And start changing you to a different language.
Yeah. God being master over physical reality, if something that's in your mind is stored, and by the way, I don't want to discount the reality that the physiology of our brain can affect what happens in our mind. People can have a brain injury or a disease that changes the way their mind works. It's also possible for there to be diseases of the mind that have no apparent diagnosis in the physical nature of the brain as well. But there is a link between the brain and the mind. Somehow they are linked, somehow they depend on one another, but I think the mind still shows traits where it is independent of purely a physical nature.
Proverbs 20:27 says, "The spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all the inner depths of his heart."
Okay, so inner depths, inner thoughts, that voice in your head, that inner dialogue. The Bible is cognizant of that lived experience. We all get it. We all understand what it means to have inner thoughts and to have an inner self and a private mind, a private self. And God knows about that. He knows how that works. And he writes in such a way that is sympathetic to that experience. The only other examples I had were Mark 7, where Jesus says, "From out of the heart proceeds all different kinds of evils." It is from the intentions, it's from the person that is within, not just that manifests itself in actions of the body. That is, the root of sin. And then lastly, Matthew 22:37, where Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And I looked up the words that each of these are. The word heart is cardia, and that's the inner thoughts and feelings. That's kind of a person's personality. Soul is suke, which is breath or spirit or life force. So you can think of like life energy, vitality. And then mind is dianoia, and that is deep thoughts or our mental faculties, our imagination, our understanding. So our thinking self. So heart is sort of the feeling self. Soul is the living self and the spirit of life that's in us, and mind is the thinking self. So
You can't do without Hebrews 4:12 then, if you're going to cover that.
Hebrews 4:12. You want to read that one for us?
So the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of the soul and spirit and the joints of the marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart.
Right.
So those are, he talks about the physical side, the joints and the marrow, but he's getting in there the soul and spirit and the thoughts and intents of the heart. So, you've got a lot of physical and
And, by saying the word pierces joints and marrow, I've never seen anyone get cut that bad by a Bible. Maybe a little paper cut, but not that severe. So, clearly he's not even thinking about physical cutting here. It's purely that non-physical, that supernatural or non-materialistic self, that mind that's being spoken of here. God is a mind, so if anything else, the fact that we have a mind that is not just a physical entity, I think is something really interesting to think about.
I think there's one good example because it demonstrates the dual nature of man pretty well, and that's in 2 Corinthians 1, talking about the promises of God, that they were established in us. I can't read. Now he who establishes us with you in Christ and anointed us as God, who also sealed us and gave us the Spirit in our hearts as a pledge. So God used two mechanisms there to satisfy sort of the intellectual sealing or anointing, and that would have been in Old Testament times an outward sign of a contract.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas he goes ahead and says the indwelling of the Spirit is a seal on the heart. And so it says you've got both bases covered in that phrase, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what part of the body is changed by an indwelling of the Spirit? What physical aspect of the body is changed or altered by the Spirit's presence? I mean, aside from maybe overall better health, if you have a sunnier dispensation, there's no change to the body from an indwelling of the Spirit. But something is still changed. There is yet a change that occurs, and that change happens to the non-physical part that makes up ourselves. And so, and we see that. You can observe that change in a person when they believe. You can see that change in a person when they are converted. And it's not something that happened in their body. It's something that happens in their mind. Good thoughts. Lots of passages there. And the point there is just to show, once we have these discussions with someone, I think it's helpful to take it back to Scripture. Maybe they don't yet think Scripture is authoritative. Maybe they don't yet think that, I'm not really sure that the Bible is all that it says to be. But if we start looking at, if this is the Word of God, looking at how it matches with our experience. The Word of God is not just a rule book, and it's not just a history book. The Bible helps us understand what it means to be human. The Bible helps us explain the feelings of being human and the experiences of life. They are present in these pages. So I felt like that exercise is a way to help us see, you can really take these points, which are kind of abstract sometimes, but tie them back to the person that you're talking to and what they have experienced and what they feel to be true, because everybody has their own thoughts. Everybody understands what it's like to have a mind. Okay. Any other comments before we go to talking about moral law? Okay. So I'll read just a hair here. Famous for being described in detail by C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity, the moral argument makes the claim that there is a universal objective standard for good and rightness. So the first thing we have to argue is, does a moral law exist? Is there such a thing as a law that governs what is right and what is wrong, that is outside of ourselves? What are some, and the first question I posed here was, what are some examples you might use to try to establish the premise of a moral law? If you'd like to argue against it, you're welcome to do that as well. What are things we experience in life that people appeal to a sense of right and wrong? Even if they don't admit it, even if they don't think that that's what they're doing. I can give you a couple that Lewis gives in his book, actually. That's not fair. People say things like, that's not fair. Whether they believe in God or not, they believe in fairness. Why do people believe in fairness? Leave him alone. He didn't do anything to you. Right? These are statements that appeal to some kind of measure, appeal to some kind of, there's some kind of statement of value of that's not the right thing to do, or that's not what you should be doing. Are there other examples?
Who made you judge over me?
Okay. So who made you judge over me? Maybe an appeal to one's own independence, could be, or it could be that your actions are somehow not right. Your judging of me or your trying to affect my life is somehow not right. Whether or not, it's almost independent of whether or not the actions the person's taking really are right or wrong. It's just the idea that in saying that, people are acknowledging that there is such a thing as right, or there is such a thing as wrong. You shouldn't do that.
Kind of the idea of like karma, like, oh, well, karma's gonna get him someday, and it's like, oh, well, you know that what he was doing was wrong, and you think that's gonna come back on him.
Okay, the notion of karma, or maybe we could call it, the law of retribution or consequences for wrong actions coming back your way. What were you going to say, Dan?
Exactly the same.
Oh, okay. Right, so the idea that if you do something bad, you deserve something bad to happen to you, or something bad is going to happen to you for having done something bad. I think it can even be more concrete than that. Looking across history and across societies, there tend to be these truths of do what you say you will do. Do not lie to someone else. Do not tell a lie for dishonest gain. Do not murder. Do not take advantage. Do not do harm against someone else. These kinds of things make up basically every cultural law system that exists. If you look at whether it's in the Bible, or you look at the Code of Hammurabi, or you look at U.S. law or Chinese law, there's still this idea of, there are things that you ought not to do. There are things that need to happen for us to function as a society. So does this mean that there's a moral law? Lewis argues that we all have a sense of, he calls it, he's British, so he says oughtness. There's a sense of oughtness. I ought to do this. We believe that we ought to behave in a certain way, and he says that we can't escape the notion that there are things that we ought to do and ought not to do, even if we are violating what we think we ought to do. Isn't it true that we're capable of doing things where we think, I ought not to be doing this, and yet we still are doing it? That sense of, maybe we'll say should so that it doesn't sound so weird, that should statement is still there in our minds. Another point that I read here, that I wrote down, and I made these notes some of these are kind of fresh, so I'm trying to remember what I wrote here. It's a law that, unlike physical laws, makes a statement of value. So remember when we were talking about the laws of nature, the laws of physics, they can tell you how something works, but they don't tell you what's the right and wrong answer, right? We use the example of cancer research can tell you how to treat a disease, but it doesn't tell you whether or not you should treat a disease or who should get treatment. Those are not answered by physical laws. But a moral law can give you answers in those kind of situations, right? It is right to treat someone who is sick. The moral law would tell us that that is a virtue, that that's something that is good. Lying is wrong, bravery is a virtue. They are statements of value. Now, someone might say, but this is just culture. This can all just be explained as culture. And he argues that there can be, and there are, cultural differences, usually in the conventions of behavior. But the big ideas of this law, if you really back up and go to the big founding ideas that make up laws in different cultures, they tend to be true across cultures and across time. So, any thoughts there? Any comments? Go ahead, Dan.
Say people who do not believe in religion at all are also very big donors to charitable organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing it because of the religious thought that's coming in, being taught that they need to donate and help others. They're doing it for what reason? It doesn't help them at all. So there's got to be something there that's making them. And yes, you can say it's kind of social or cultural thing, but there's people who have no cultural influences that are still doing this and looking out for others. So I think that's it's a good thing to donate to this cause. Why is it a good thing to donate to this cause? Well, it's helping other people. Well, so it's not it's not helping me, but why would I worry about other people?
Right.
So there's going to be some sort of reason there, and like I said, it still goes back to that. Thinking about others is a God-given thing.
Right. and speaking to the universality of the moral law, even someone who would say, no, I don't think there's such a thing as a universal moral law, they will act in a way that seems to indicate that they think there is actions that are right and actions that they should do. They will think that there are things that are wrong and there are things that should not be done or that they don't want to happen to them. So even if you find someone who says, I don't think there's a moral law, I don't think there's a God-given moral law, the point is they behave in a way as if they know that there is a moral law. Even if they're not acknowledging it themselves, they live their lives acting like there is a moral law. To truly deny that there is any kind of moral law, I think is a fairly, it's a hard experience to even picture, or it's a hard existence to imagine. I mean, what lengths would you have to go to say there is no objective moral law? You would have to then say there's no point in any of our laws. There's no point in any kind of justice. There's no such thing as conviction or punishment for something that's wrong. Everything and anything is equally right and valuable. I mean, the end results, the end conclusions you have to make is you have to be fine with anything. You have to be fine with everything. Because if there is no moral standard to appeal to, how are you existing in a society? How are you existing as a species with rules if that's your viewpoint? I think anyone who says that there is no moral law has not truly gone to the furthest extent of what they would have to believe in order to say there is no moral law. I think that's just too far gone of a conclusion. I've never heard someone who lives their life actually thinking that. You can take the most diehard atheist and they will be totally fine with saying, yeah, murder should be illegal. Murder shouldn't be okay. Well, why? Why?
A lot of times they'll say, we don't need religion to say what's right or wrong, what's good for people and bad for people.
Mm-hmm.
But just like you said, without a set standard, I mean, who sets the standard?
Mm-hmm. Right, and that gets us into the next point in Lewis's argument. Okay, so if we can establish there is some kind of moral law, you might think there's not, but you act like there is. So there is a universal moral law. The next question is, where did that law come from? So we're saying that law comes from a God who sets the standard of right and wrong. But even if you acknowledge, okay, there are moral truths, there are moral generalities, what are some other ways that they could try to explain the existence of that? And I had a few here, and I wanted us to try to think about how would we refute these kinds of statements. So number one, there is a moral law, but it's instinct. It's our evolved instincts. We learned through evolution that if I share food with the rest of my species, that they'll treat me better, and if I protect the young of other members of my species, there's this social cohesion. And so that's just an evolved behavior. Animals do it sometimes, so it's just instinct. What would you say to someone who says, yeah, there's moral law, but it's instinct?
Why would there then be so much debate and conflict over what the extent of that moral law is? If it was all by instinct, we wouldn't even press for human institutions to try to enforce any kind of sense of justice or rightness. We wouldn't need the courts, we wouldn't need legislators, because we'd all just do what was the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah, so instinct, if we are truly driven by instinct, and this kind of goes back to that, if the mind is merely a material thing, if we're just driven by instincts are not so easily acted against or ignored. We tend to be creatures, above all else, who have the ability to suppress our instincts and tamper down what our instincts might be telling us to do, and instead saying, even though my instincts are telling me this, I should do this. And there we see, again, that we're aware of something that is right that doesn't match with our instincts. The instinct to reproduce, would drive one to say, well, if I'm just following my instincts, there's all kinds of immoral and what we would say wrong behavior that could derive from just following that instinct. But it is our mind, it's our sense of morality that enables us to say, even though I have this instinct that is a natural instinct, I can control it, I can suppress it. We often find ourselves thinking we ought not to do something that instinct tells us to do. That's what I just said. One way I saw this put was that the moral law exists as an additional layer on top of instinct. So Instinct is, something that might drive us to an initial behavior, but then we usually filter that decision also through this layer of, is this something I should be doing? Is this something that I ought to do? Any other thoughts there on the moral law as an evolved concept? I guess the other point I would make to someone is just that there are things we look to as laudable and praiseworthy traits that completely go against our interests of survival. Sacrifice in battle for a cause that you believe in. That's not a good use of your time from an evolutionary standpoint. You are sacrificing your genetic material for nothing because now you haven't reproduced. You failed in the evolutionary task of surviving and continuing on your genetic lineage. Stories of people who, there was a story that I saw, one person who was talking through this concept. There was a man in the New York subway, someone had a seizure and fell onto the tracks, and he jumped down, the train was coming, and he takes this person and covers him between the rails, and there was just enough room. The train passed over them, they both survived, and this guy was praised as a hero. He made the papers, and it was a big story when this happened. Totally, evolutionarily and instincts, totally idiotic thing to do. From an evolutionary standpoint, the guy's a loser, and natural selection would say he deserves to die because he doesn't know how to keep himself alive. But the moral law says he's a hero, and we praise that kind of thing even though it goes against instinct, it goes against that natural inclination. And even to say, well, it's reciprocal, I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. I'll pick your fleas if you pick my fleas. That has a survival advantage, but it only goes so far. We see in human behavior things that have no bearing on our survival that we still praise as good.
To that point, you see in nature some instinct, natural good behavior in different animals, but it only goes so far. You don't see in them the complexity of our moral law. I think instinctually you could almost argue that evolution and adaptation get you to a certain point. But when you look at the human species, ours goes way beyond that. When we're watching the monkeys in Costa Rica, they don't share real well. I mean, they grab from each other and push each other, and they fight with each other for territory. And if something spooks one of them, they just turn tail and run. They don't try and get everybody to go with them. It is survival of the fittest. And you see in humans such a complex moral law, and we all have differing levels that we want to engage with that.
Right. And I would say, too, the motive behind human actions assigns value, whereas animal motives don't do it out of a calculation of value. If monkeys pick each other's fleas, that's because there's something to be gained. There's still something to be gained from a survival standpoint. Rarely, if ever, I think, will creatures in nature act against the drive for survival. And humans can, and humans do. And we still see that as praiseworthy. Okay, we'll finish up on this on Sunday. A couple other ideas maybe to talk about for moral law, including maybe some passages. I don't know if there's any beyond, we may have already covered the ones that I had in mind, but we'll touch on that on Sunday and then probably get into the next sheet, which is available in the back. Thank you all for your comments this evening.